Hello, my name is Mage and welcome to Black and White Thinking. Today's video is going to be a little bit more low-key. I have some opinions on the recent Lord of the Rings series, Rings of Power, that aired on Amazon. I have some opinions on Tolkien generally. And I have some opinions on other people's opinions that are so bad I need to tear them apart in a video. So here it is. The day has finally come where I talk about Lord of the Rings. I've tried to save you guys from this for so long. I love Lord of the Rings and I love Tolkien, and I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about it while it's relevant and run with it. I hope you enjoy this, like I said, slightly more chilled out, but still just as ranty video. If you do enjoy the content on this channel, please consider subscribing, liking, sharing, all that good stuff. You can join the Discord, follow me on Instagram, Twitch, email me if you so wish. Anyway, let's get into it.
Will you look into the mirror? What will I see?
Now, this video is going to come in a few parts, and I haven't scripted it. It's just a bunch of notes I've been making over the past few weeks. I wanted to be a bit more laid back. I wanted to be able to be a bit more free in what I said, so here we are. I have a few points I want to cover, and I'm going to try and break them down into easy, digestible pieces where I can. So first point, and I think this is incredibly important off the bat, Amazon sucks, and I don't want people to think that any defense I have for the writing of this show reaches to Jeff Bezos. It doesn't. The man sucks, the company sucks, and it should be wiped off the face of the planet as far as I'm concerned. Reminder that if you work, join a union. I wished I lived in an ideal world where corporations didn't make my favourite art, especially corporations like Amazon, but we don't live in that one. So I acknowledge the capitalist hellscape. I put it to one side for the moment, and I'm going to actually talk about the show. Because, well, one, it's perfectly okay to do that. You can. Like, Jeff Bezos didn't write this show, he didn't direct it, he just put some money up for it. Wait until people find out what Harvey Weinstein did for a living. But also, I wish more criticism of this show had been aimed at the fact that Amazon had made it. That lasted for about 5 minutes, and now people have come up with a bunch of other terrible opinions about why this show is bad, and almost all of them are to do with racism and misogyny. If people just don't like the show, that's fine. If people want to criticize the show for being made by Amazon, also fine. If people want to dissect it and have genuine complaints, also fine. But again, as I just said, a lot of complaints about this show are just straight up laced with bigotry. I'm gonna talk about them. Too long didn't read, Amazon bad, I'm discussing Adaptation. On a contextual, personal note, I love Tolkien. I love Lord of the Rings, I love the Silmarillion. I have read everything that Tolkien has ever published book-wise, all of his notes and appendices. I've read the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, I read Unfinished Tales. I even read the Kalevala when I was rereading the Silmarillion and the Mabinogion. Like, I'm super into myth. I've made that clear on this channel. It's kind of what I want to do with my life eventually. I'm not going into that right now. One thing I will say outright is, as someone who's read a lot of fantasy, whose life is the fantasy genre, that's kind of what I eat, sleep, and breathe at this point, I truly believe that Galadriel is the single most important character in fantasy, modern fantasy out of the last 100 years, outside of perhaps like Cthulhu. To understand Tolkien's work, to understand Middle-earth and all the events around it, is to understand Galadriel. She is the linchpin of his universe. She was also one of Tolkien's favourite characters that he ever created. Christopher has spoken about this in interviews before. I'm also super into Sauron. When I read the Silmarillion, I was blown away by how important the relationship, both on page and implied off page, how important Sauron and Galadriel's relationship was. The Silmarillion is not an easy thing to read. I've met plenty of people that literally cannot get through it. It's a heavy text written in a obtuse and mildly obnoxious English tongue. It also leaves a lot to the imagination, which is why Tolkien fanfic is kind of needed, and fan interpretation has always been so wide. Why Tolkien scholarship kind of exists. Tolkien presents a lot of ideas on the page to discuss, but he also presents a lot of ideas off page to discuss, and this has been a thing in Tolkien scholarship for years. These arguments about what Tolkien implies and what fans assume. And that's okay. That is something that Tolkien encourages. It's why he does things like not tell people who the Witch King is. He wants there to be an air of mystery to his world. He wants there to be questions unanswered. He wanted it to be a living, breathing piece of British mythology. And in order for it to be mythology, he could not answer all questions historically. I was so fascinated by that relationship, the relationship that exists both within the Silmarillion text and off-page within my imagination based on what Tolkien wrote. So fascinated by the Sauron and Galadriel relationship that I've based my entire fantasy novel that I'm writing at the moment around it. And Galadriel and Sauron are not in my fantasy novel, but the concept of a relationship between someone like Sauron and someone like Galadriel over the course of thousands of years, these two great and powerful beings kind of using the world as their battleground, a battle of wits that lasts 1,000, 10,000 years. I love that shit, man. So first point, I really liked, and I didn't think I would, Galadriel and Sauron's portrayal in the recent Rings of Power. I was scared to trust it at first, but now the finale has aired, I feel really good about how, and I'll talk about Galadriel first because she's definitely the most important here, how Galadriel was portrayed. And I'm kind of shocked that other people don't feel the same. I have read some shocking things on the internet over the last few weeks in regards to Galadriel. Things that are just plainly wrong, and then things that are just plainly hateful. True misogyny, because women in fantasy are hated. It's just a fact. Rings of Power is not an adaptation of the Silmarillion, even though it is adapting the years that pass within the Silmarillion. Amazon did not buy the rights to the Silmarillion. They bought the rights to Lord of the Rings and the appendices that are attached to it, which means they can only do certain things. And I'm not going to sit here and read the appendices to you, but they're not very long, especially in comparison to Lord of the Rings, the actual story, and the Silmarillion. There's enough in Lord of the Rings and the appendices for them to have some fun making a fanfic of the Second Age Silmarillion that is thematically honest to Tolkien's ideas. But obviously they cannot literally adapt the things that people are complaining they haven't literally adapted. And for those people, I have no real words. Like, that's a straw man. It's not an honest critique of the show or the adaptation. It seems really silly to be upset that the show that isn't adapting the Silmarillion isn't adapting the Silmarillion the way you want it to. Another complaint I've seen is that people are upset that this isn't just a straight up adaptation of the Silmarillion, and I've read the Silmarillion front to back 3 times. It is not something that could be adapted, in my opinion. At least not outside of animation. I've always imagined that the First Age specifically would probably look really sick as an anime, but the Silmarillion is a story about gods, and gods are not easy to portray on screen. I despise Amazon, but people have not gone into this show with good faith, and their understanding of Galadriel is proof of that. As I said, Galadriel is single-handedly, in my opinion, the most important character in fantasy in the last 100 years, especially the most important woman, outside of Moiraine, maybe. But even then, Moiraine is just Galadriel and Gandalf mixed together. And there has been a blatant and almost purposeful misrepresentation of Galadriel within fan spaces recently. Not the show, which I genuinely was really worried about how they would portray Galadriel. No, that's actually turned out kind of okay. But the fan spaces, I've heard a few things. I saw one person, and I'm not going to shame people, I'm not going to put these quotes up online. You can just search Rings of Power if you want to see this trash. Like, go on Reddit, go on Twitter, you'll see it everywhere. The same people that hate Star Wars for having too many brown people and women seem to hate this show too. What a coincidence. Anyway, I've seen some terrible takes. I saw one person saying that the show would have been great, and this person was a woman. This person said that the show would be great if you simply just cut all the scenes with Galadriel out. You want to know something that would upset Tolkien? That. I really hate when people talk on behalf of Tolkien, by the way. That's another thing that's driven me crazy. People being like, Tolkien would hate this. Tolkien would be rolling in his grave. 90% of the people that are saying those things have not read the Silmarillion, have not bothered to read his letters or lectures, and even then, you have no right to talk for Tolkien. He is dead. John Tolkien is dead. Christopher Tolkien is dead. His grandchildren are in charge right now, and they don't even really have a right to talk for his work. The creation of this world was something that him and Christopher did together, and none of us can actually say what he thinks. But when you do read his letters and his notes, you can see a perfect path laid out from Tolkien's work to the portrayal of Galadriel in this show. And I don't give a shit if Amazon made it. That's just true. Thematically, for me, Second Age Galadriel needs to kind of hit 3 major beats. And again, that's kind of really hard to do if you don't have the Silmarillion to adapt. But those 3 beats would be her rejecting Valinor. I don't really care how it happens. The lack of Fëanor in the show is definitely blatant to someone that's read the Silmarillion, don't get me wrong. But seeing Galadriel reject Valinor is important, or understanding that she does, at least. The second point I think is most important for Second Age Galadriel is her complicity in accidentally bringing back Sauron. When you read the Second Age, when you read what happens at Eregion, when you read Alcalabeth, when you read the notes that Tolkien has made outside of the books on this matter, one of the things that makes Sauron so scary, and not just the fact that he is the world's best fascist, I'm not sure how you'd phrase that, is that he tricks those that should be untrickable. So Galadriel is not tricked by gods. She sees their promises and she rejects them. She is the woman that said no to heaven and walked away from it. And yet Sauron, as Anatar, as the Lord of Gifts, manages to worm his way in to the High Elves and all of their bullshit. And that's important. It's important to know that, one, as Gil-galad said in this show, that sometimes we can court the darkness we so badly wish to destroy when we envelop ourselves in it, and Tolkien talks about that a lot in Lord of the Rings thematically. But her getting tricked by Sauron in the Silmarillion itself is a big thing for Galadriel, implied or otherwise. It's huge. This is not necessarily how I would have made it happen. I personally would have made it a lot gayer. We would have had Sauron dating Galadriel and Celebrimbor in my Silmarillion fanfiction, but that relationship at Eregion, that tricking, her complicity in creating the rings exists. And that is not Galadriel being responsible for the rings. That is a completely different thing. Sauron is responsible for the rings. Sauron is pure evil. And even when he wants to be redeemed, he cannot be. He is beyond evil. Tolkien uses him as a metaphor for benevolent evil, malignant evil, an evil that exists in our world. In the same way that Galadriel is light, right? He represents darkness. And the fact that the dark can trick you, that anyone can be corrupted, is the heart of Lord of the Rings. From Frodo all the way up to Galadriel. I'm not a huge fan of allegory. Tolkien wasn't either, but there are a lot of underlying Christian themes here to do with original sin, right? And forgiveness, true soul forgiveness for the things that we've done wrong. Galadriel's origin story happens multiple times. She lives so long. She has these huge chapters of her life that are so different than the one that came before. But this is the origin story of the Galadriel we see exist in Lord of the Rings. And in Lord of the Rings, my favourite female moment in all of Lord of the Rings is when Galadriel, after her great speech about being as terrible as the earth, looks at Frodo and says,
I passed the test. I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel.
When you add that quote in everything that happens in Lord of the Rings to the younger Galadriel that we know in the Silmarillion, both the one from Valinor and the one in Middle-earth, it doesn't take a genius to weave the story of a traumatized war veteran. And it blows my mind that people can't seem to understand that. This show did a really good job of that. Galadriel is not a girl boss with a sword. This isn't what this is. Galadriel is a war veteran, and people are really quick to see The Lord of the Rings and Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin and see the trauma of war in them. This band of brothers that go off to war and come home changed, different. When Tolkien applies that to Galadriel throughout thousands of years of history, people seem to ignore it. People act like it doesn't exist. But Galadriel's story is one of trauma. Another terrible take I saw was people being like, why is she so jaded? Why is she so angry? Like she didn't see a spider the size of a small town drain the light of the gods before her. I'm a big defender of Tolkien, I always will be. He is not the racist or the misogynist that people want him to be. People on the right and people that are just shitty bigots, they want him to be because Tolkien represents a very Eurocentric ideal, right? And they want that Eurocentric ideal to be tied to racism, which is a cop-out. Thinking that all Europeans, all white Europeans, are just instantly racist requires white Europeans to do no work and just accept that about themselves. And it's not true. Tolkien was a staunch anti-fascist, and he adored women. He just didn't understand them very well, and not in a Ben Shapiro doesn't understand women way. He just stayed in his lane. He went to war and learned about brotherhood. He went to Oxford and learned about brotherhood. He had a brother. He had 2 sons. He knew what brotherhood was. That's why he wrote about brotherhood and not sisterhood in The Lord of the Rings. There are not enough characters that are female in The Lord of the Rings, but they exist. And they exist without being violently brutalized, like the way women are in most other fantasy novels. People, white supremacists, will always try and convince you that Tolkien was one of them. He wasn't. I also think Lovecraft is one of the greatest fantasy writers of all time, and he was a racist and a misogynist. Tolkien once wrote to the Nazis and told them to F off. Hi there, editing mage here. Just to make my point, I wanted to include a little quote from Tolkien. This wasn't when he wrote to Nazi publishers and told them to go away. This is a quote from a letter he wrote to his son Michael. Michael fought in World War II, as Tolkien fought in World War I, and Michael and John exchanged a lot of letters over that time. They exchanged a lot of letters generally. When Michael was at school, Tolkien wrote to him a lot as well. Anyway, here is a quote. I have in this war a burning private grudge against the ruddy little ignoramus Adolf Hitler, ruining, perverting, misapplying and making forever accursed that noble northern spirit, a supreme contribution to Europe, which I have ever loved and tried to present in its true light. So yeah, there's been a lot of people talking about how Tolkien would hate girl boss Galadriel. Girl boss Galadriel doesn't exist, and I wish people would stop saying the word girl boss. You're doing more harm to women by using this bullshit language made up by oppressors than applying it to random things on TV you don't like. Like, please just read a book on feminist theory. None of that is true. Tolkien wrote Galadriel to be a hero, one of the most important heroes in his work, and at every point she appears in every age outside of the creation of the music of the Aina. She is, outside of the Maya, the Valar themselves, she's as powerful as it gets when it comes to being an elf. She's as old as it gets when it comes to being an elf. To Gil-galad and Elrond, she is a rambling old woman chatting on about a conspiracy. This is because she is a veteran. She is the guy that cannot stop thinking about the war because he's still there. And again, people understand that with Frodo because he's a dude. But when that narrative is told through a woman, apparently that's just Amazon changing the story, even though it isn't. Again, this thread exists throughout Tolkien's work and throughout Galadriel's art, and if you can't see that, that's because you can't read. And I don't mean literally can't read, I mean literary can't read. Reading is not just taking in the words on the page, there has to be more to it than that. You have to think about what you're given, and Tolkien requires that of people, and if people are going to be stupid, then this isn't the thing for them. I know Lord of the Rings looks simple, but it really isn't. Another take I saw was that apparently Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power was pro-war, which, again, I point back to the fact that they have heavily focused on how Galadriel is a war veteran traumatized in a way that nobody else can understand, just as Tolkien portrays her. But again, I've seen multiple people say that that's pro-war, which is crazy, because I don't think using the act of war in your story is pro-war, and if it was, that would make Tolkien pro-war too. Because outside of that, there aren't really any pro-war themes. Medals for soldiers, accolades. There are a few Númenórean kids who fought for the chance to become a lieutenant. That is very normal for Tolkien. Merry and Pippin become squires to important men. They want to go to war. It's honourable to fight evil that wants to infect your country. That just actually has to be evil and not propaganda. Tolkien doesn't live now. When he was writing these books, he was fighting evil. And he was sending his sons to fight some of the purest evil we have ever known. It's one of the reasons that white supremacists do not get to take Tolkien as their own. The one thing I'm sure of when it comes to Tolkien, the one thing I am happy to say on his behalf, is that he was an anti-fascist. Because Sauron is a fascist. That's what Sauron is. He creates his own language to eradicate everyone else's. He wants to enforce black speech on the orcs, and then he wants the orcs to enforce black speech on everyone else. He wants perfect, ordered unison. He wants every person to be productive 100% of the time. He calls the erasure of culture and tyranny over all people peace. Lord of the Rings, above everything else, is an anti-fascist piece of work. People are quick to paint it Christian. People are quick to paint it as a metaphor for his experiences in the war. It is about the tyranny that comes with fascism and the tools that fascists use to oppress us. And that is where the real complaint with Rings of Power should lie, in the fact that Amazon have a Palantir in my own house right now. I own 3 Alexas. That's the great terrible of Rings of Power. Not that Galadriel holds a sword or can do some cool tricks. Of course she can. She's an elf, who's thousands of years old, and has been practicing with said sword for those thousands of years. And survivor's guilt for soldiers is normal. You guys are just not used to seeing it being portrayed through the eyes of a woman. It's why people ignore it in Lord of the Rings. It's why Galadriel and Gandalf know the heartbreak of Frodo arguably better than anyone else. It's why they look at him and cannot not cry. It's why Galadriel makes sure he has the light of Elbereth. It's why she cares so much that he makes it to Mordor.
I cannot do this alone. You are a ring bearer, Frodo. To bear a ring of power is to be alone.
She has survivor's guilt, surviving Finrod, surviving her entire family, even though they all were lord bastards, and the guilt of being complicit in that by accident in the same way that everyone else is. It's Galadriel's great humbling moment when she realises that she is not necessarily more powerful than any other elf. She's just older, because she too is tricked by the great deceiver. None of us are immune to Satan. And that's why I liked Rings of Power. That's what Rings of Power did. It focused on Galadriel as a woman who was built with trauma. Trauma that she did not create herself. Trauma that she, for very many lifetimes, was standing at the side of. It was being caused by those closest to her, and she felt like she had little say in. At this point in the Second Age, all she has is the memory of those people, and she cannot stand on the side any longer. There's no one else to watch, they're all dead. She has to pick up the sword or the fight dies. And to do that without turning dark is impossible. It's why so many of the other elves fail or just die in the process. She doesn't. She rejects the ring. She learns from those mistakes. She will sail west, and she will remain Galadriel. And that's the beauty of her story, that circular essence of the light leaving Valinor and the light returning. And Rings of Power understood the assignment in that regard. It understood the thematic point. It didn't just do that with Galadriel, but it did it with Elrond and Durin. It did it with, spoilers, the Astari and the Hobbits, Harfoots, which again, I also really enjoyed some of the Harfoot stuff, and people have been complaining about that because it's, not made by Peter Jackson? Is that it? Is that the best argument anyone has? Because Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings is far from perfect. Peter Jackson himself will admit that. And the Hobbit movies are a bastardization, if anything. Truly one of the worst adaptations of all time, the Hobbit movies. There's nobody who with a straight face can tell me that the Hobbit movies were better than Rings of Power. Okay, that was essentially a 20-minute rant about Galadriel. I mentioned a few of the other things in the show that I enjoyed. I want to quickly touch on all that because, again, I just ranted about Galadriel for a long time, which is fine, but I want to make sure I touch on the other stuff as well before I actually end this video. So, as mentioned, I loved the dwarves. I loved seeing Khazad-dûm. I loved the menage a trois between Disa, Durin and Elrond. I loved seeing Durin. Durin was so great. My girlfriend was getting super attached to him and I was like, don't do that. I loved the teasing of Durin's bane. I wish Disa had a beard. Truly, desperately wish she had a beard. And I wish Elrond had long hair, but these things seem a bit fickle to stress about in the grand scheme of Tolkien themes. I didn't really emotionally care for Bronwyn and Arondir, but I grew to like Theo as a character, which I really didn't expect to, and I liked Arondir too. Bronwyn was a jar of mayonnaise in terms of character development, and she literally ran into an arrow in one episode, but I can't really blame the character for being the worst written woman in the show, can I? The Númenóreans, something I thought would be really hard to put on screen, just generally, was actually quite interesting and beautiful. Númenor was gorgeous to watch, full of life. in a way that things like Game of Thrones can often seem very barren. You can see where the money was spent in this show and it was worth it. Enjoyed more of the Númenóreans than I thought. Miriel and Elendil are two of my personal favourite characters generally. I love Elendil so much and I fancy the guy that's playing him right now. I love a Calibeth, I said that earlier. And regardless of the time issues involved, seeing a young golden retriever Isildur, who loves Middle-earth, his dad and Galadriel, is exactly what I want to see from my Lord of the Rings fan works. By me, I think that's great and I love it. And I think it's going to be really heartbreaking to see this Isildur become the Isildur we know. He'll rise so high and then it will all go to shit. As I said, I really like the Harfoots. I loved seeing women at the heart of Hobbit stories. It's overdue and we deserve it. And as much as I personally wish that the stranger was actually Saruman, I understand why he was Gandalf. Again, this isn't the film, this is essentially backstory fill-in for normies who enjoyed the Jackson movies and want to get into Tolkien. And that's okay, I'm fine with that. I'm actually just having fun with this. I wish more people would be open to that. Gil-galad was perfect. I saw a lot of people saying he was too pious and too much of a politician. He's Gil-galad. I think he's perfectly in character and the guy that played him was great. There is definitely something to be said about the weirdness around the creation of the three before the rest of the rings. Don't get me wrong on that. But given the last few scenes of the finale and how the end of the season played out, I feel like that will be a big part of season 2, so I'm willing to let that kind of play out before I complain about it too much, because we haven't actually seen much of that plot, it's just happened. I cried really hard when Lenny Henry died, and I never thought I'd say that sentence out loud. That stuff with the hobbits and the finale was genuinely sad. All being said and done, The Rings of Power was good, simply for this one shot of Galadriel and Sauron that I am absolutely going to get tattooed somewhere on my body. It was just look at that. Look at that shot. It's beautiful, it's amazing, I love it. Rings of Power was actually kind of okay. And most of the hate for it is bad faith, or bigoted. I hope you enjoyed this excessively long rant about Lord of the Rings. It's always fun to have unscripted chats with you guys. If you want to see more shit like this, you know where to find me. This has been Black and White Thinking. My name is Mage. Stay safe. Bye.